All
weekend.
right, we did it. Well, hello, Arizona. I'm very glad to be here, and welcome to everybody on the other end. I'm going to just hit the ground running here because there's a lot to cover, and we'll have a couple of sections where I'll stop and we'll take some questions and answers. But let me start off with just the learning objectives for the day. We're going to look at, I'm going to move this out of my way. We're going to talk about the importance of writing IEPs that align to the Common Core. We're going to briefly look at the structure of the Common Core and the instructional shifts that are part of the Common Core, and speak specifically about how, as special educators, we can be looking at the impact this might have on kids with disabilities. And then we're going to identify sort of the basic construct of how to think about aligning IEPs to the general ed curriculum. This is hopefully going to be, for several of you, maybe just the beginning of this journey, and hopefully I'll whet your appetite for more information. We have a relatively short period of time. Hopefully I'll see some folks later on in March, or at least give you some ideas of the kind of questions you need to be asking and the resources with which to find some of those answers. I think, to start the whole conversation off, we really need to talk about the bigger concept of access to the general ed curriculum. Since 1997, IDEA has required us to write IEPs that are designed to help kids get access to the general education curriculum, as well as have IEPs that meet their unique educational needs. And I think we've, as a field, and I think as an entire educational community across the country, we've found a lot of challenges in trying to make that happen. And this visual here is sort of my attempt to put a picture to what the metacognitive process I've gone through over the last 15 years or so to try to make sense of what do we actually mean by access to the curriculum. And I think we're really talking about the interweaving and the interdependence of general education and special education working collaboratively. As you see on the left-hand side, several elements of things that we would consider really good, necessary components of general education. All of those things: guaranteed curriculum, universal design of learning, response to intervention, effective use of instructional technology. Those are all elements that in and of themselves, any one of them doesn't provide good quality education. It's the interplay of all of those things together that provides really good instruction for kids. Likewise for special education, lots of critical components, no one piece does it. All of those things interacting together make for high quality special ed. I think we're in a period of time now where public policy requires us to go beyond what's good regular ed and what's good special ed, and to really talk about what's good education for all kids. And I think it's the intertwining, the weaving of all of those strands together that makes good quality education. And I truly believe all kids require some element of all of these things. And the thing that distinguishes one student from another is really just the nature of the weave of those strands for an individual kid. Some kids will have way more strands embedded in the general ed system with little elements of special ed, and other students it'll be just the other way. But as we go through this whole discussion, I think we can't lose sight of a major requirement for IDEA and special education and IEPs is that we are mindful of how do we provide access to kids with disabilities. And access is to the general ed curriculum. The general ed curriculum is a broad category that is really embedded into when we talk about a Common Core set of standards. The Arizona Common Core, which are based on Common Core that probably 46 or 47 states have all adopted now. So we're going to talk about IEPs that align to the standards. So we'll operationalize a couple of things. What do we mean by align? If we just go right to the dictionary, align is to get or fall into line. I like the second definition, to be in or come into precise adjustment or correct relative position. I think that captures it. We want IEPs that put into the correct relative position how we're going to approach meeting kids' unique disability-related needs in correct relative position to the bigger things we want all students to know and be able to do. So we'll start off with what are IEPs aligned to the standards not? And I think right off, this is not about cutting and pasting standards. It's not about direct quotes of this is ELA standard, such and such. It's not a restatement of the general ed courses, general ed curriculum, scope, and sequence. I think standards are sort of our guiding star, our North Star. Standards have to be based on thoughtful description of students' present levels of performance and areas of disability. That's what grounds us in special education. Everything begins with the student's present level and how their disability is going to affect their progress. IEPs aligned to standards are based on the assumption that kids can access the general ed curriculum, should access the curriculum, will access the curriculum when appropriate accommodations are in place, and we design specially designed instruction based on the targeted skills and behaviors kids need in relationship to their disability. And lastly, it's about the collaboration, the blurring of the lines between general ed and special ed, in that no one discipline is going to be successful with all kids. We're only going to be able to ensure kids have their needs met and access the general ed curriculum when both general and special educators see this as a shared responsibility. So as we proceed, we're going to be constantly going back to the relevant parts of the IEP we need to be mindful as we talk about alignment to the standards. What are those things that we can address in the IEP through accommodations? In other words, the student may be quite capable of accessing the curriculum, showing us, learning and doing what we would expect all kids, if in fact we can eliminate specific barriers that are getting in the student's way, and when those barriers are removed, they don't fundamentally change the purpose of the standard. So accommodations are critical, and then we know for many kids with disabilities, even beyond the accommodations which allow them to participate, they have some specific needs that are going to be met through the IEP on targeted goals. In other words, what do we hope the student will do differently relative to a skill or a behavior based on the specially designed instruction? So this is an oversimplification, but I think it works. Accommodations are about what we're going to ask the adults in a child's life to do differently. In other words, what are the curricular, instructional, or assessment barriers we as educators may be putting in front of a student, and how could we adjust those? And then the specially designed instruction is sort of, that's where special education comes into the mix. So if we were to look at the standards, I don't know how many folks are familiar with the structure, but we're going to take a quick walk through the standards. And you see the website here, which takes you right to the Arizona Common Core Standards. We are going to start off with English Language Arts. The standards are composed of English Language Arts and Mathematics. English Language Arts You'll see the 4 bullets address reading, writing, listening, and speaking, and language. And there's 3 sort of components to the standards themselves. There are what we call college and career readiness standards. These are broad statements, broad standards about these 4 areas. They run through and sort of transcend any grade level. There are certain things we want students to be able to do at every grade level. Those are the anchor standards. And then the things that are referred to as English language arts standards, which cover K through 12, specify in these 4 areas what kids will do at specific grade levels. The additional piece to the standards that many other state standards in the past haven't had are these literacy and history, social studies, science, and technical subjects. They are directed for grades 6 through 12, and they're specifically intended for content classes. If you look at the standards for ELA K-12, those are the things we traditionally think of as the English language arts teacher teaching. The literacy standards are what we really think of as social studies, history, things like that. How can those teachers be continually assisting kids in developing literacy skills relative to accessing the content? If you look at this slide here, you see the basic structure of reading, writing, speaking, and language. And then you'll see in the next box, information, literature and information text. You'll see 4 big ideas there. These are all part of the anchor standards. And then you'll see the same in each of those subsequent boxes. So the anchor standards are the big ideas, and then the grade level standards start to get more specific about what would it look like in each grade. Here's an excerpt right from the Arizona standards. If you look at, these happen to be for grades 3 and 5. I'm just going to share up here. The grade is listed. This happens to be around informational text. There's also literary text. There are standards on foundational skills. Then for each grade, you'll see these anchor standards. These are the headings here. And then you'll also see the bulleted, the numbers between each of those. They begin to describe, in this particular case, for key ideas and details, this is what 3rd graders would be able to know and be able to do to meet the standards for 3rd grade. And then they go across the page for each subsequent grade level. So Arizona has bands. The standards in Arizona focus on students in K2, and then band of 3-5, and then they go on to 6-8, and then the high school standards. All right, so let me move on now. In addition to the things we've just looked at, the standards themselves, there are 3 supporting documents to English language arts. They are these 3 appendices, and I'm going to now quickly walk through the different things that you will find. There's some great resources. These are all on the Arizona Department of Ed website that I referenced earlier. Appendix A provides the background research that contributed to the authors of the Common Core standard selecting the standards that they did. It really gives a very nice overview of the research behind the selection of reading standards, writing, listening, speaking, and language. It's a wonderful document. I highly recommend anybody who's working with kids around English language arts read this document. It's chock full of great information. Appendix B shows exemplars for text, and then C for writing, and I'm going to show you some of the examples there. So shifts in ELA and literacy. So I want to just put it in context. When I talk about the shifts in ELA, Arizona has adopted the Common Core, as have many states across the country. All of our states prior to the Common Core all had curriculum frameworks or standards. In the past, each state developed them independent of each other. The difference now is the Common Core has been adopted by the vast majority of states, and each state now has made some minor adaptations to them. But when we talk about the shifts in the Common Core, we're talking about general shifts. If you were to look at the body of all the standards in the past and what ELA has now, now includes, these are general directions that are somewhat, some departure from previous standards. And I'm going to give you some examples of all of these, but the real key ones we're looking at are balancing information and literary text, increased staircase of complexity, looking at different writing sources, and academic vocabulary. And these are the ones that I'm going to highlight briefly because I think they have really significant implications, not just for all kids, but specifically for special educators. The increase on emphasis on reading information. If you look at this little chart here, you'll see the NAEP, the National Test, Achievement Testing. The test that kids take in grades 4, 8, and 12, they have a real balance at grade 4, 50% of either of literary and information text. And then as you go through the grades, you will see the increased emphasis on informational text versus literary text as we go through the grades. So the Common Core standards were written to move curriculum to better meet that starting with a more balanced approach and then moving kids increasingly towards allocating time for informational text. The thinking behind that is when kids go on to college or kids go on to the world of work, the literacy skills they need in those environments really focus on informational text. So I think that's, again, one of those major things we need to be thinking about as we're looking at what are the different kind of comprehension strategies we teach kids to comprehend literature versus information text. And I think putting more emphasis on the informational text is going to have some implications for IEPs. Range of reading and staircase of complexity. I think pretty much everywhere I go, people are really struck by the increased level of text complexity that the Common Core is expecting of kids at each grade level. And text complexity is a fairly complex concept. I mean, the simple part of it is the quantitative dimensions of text complexity, things like number of words in a sentence, number of, how long sentences are, how frequent the words in sentences are. But there's a whole lot of dimensions to this, and I think one of the nice things that Common Core does in the Appendix B is it gives some great background information as well as gives pages and pages and pages of examples of the kind of text they think kids should be reading at various grade levels in terms of text complexity. This just happens to be a snapshot of the table of contents for the 4-5 band. You'll see for stories, there's 7 or 8 different examples. They give examples for poetry and, for informational text. Then they give you excerpts, examples of the text itself, and then give examples of sample performance tasks. If a student was reading Alice in Wonderland, what would be the kind of performance task we would expect kids to be able to engage in and demonstrate as a result of reading text at that level? So Appendix B is a wonderful resource, rich with great information. The other piece I'd want to focus on is the real shift in writing. And this also comes from the National Assessment for Educational Performance. They focus on 3 different types of writing: persuasion, explanatory, and narrative. And you can see also over the grades how the shift goes from sort of equal to increasingly more, 80%, in grade 12 of persuasion and explanatory versus 20 of experience. So very similar to reading, the idea is when kids leave school and go into the world of work or college, the nature of the kinds of writing tasks they have are not personal narrative. They really are regarding opinion, claim and evidence, persuasive documents, and technical documents. So there's really an emphasis, and then in Appendix C, they spend a lot of, they provide a lot of examples of, here are exemplars of kids' different kinds of writing. You'll see at the top here, the field trip one is an argument, glowing shoes, narrative, informative, explanatory, and they give multiple examples. Here happens to be an 6th grade argument. So an exemplar of what that you might expect a child at grade 6 to write, and then goes on to give annotations. If you look at these bulleted areas on this slide, these are almost verbatim the kind of indicators that are embedded in the writing Common Core standards, around argument. So it then breaks down the document to show, and here's an example. This is what we would say introduces a claim looks like, organizes the reasons and evidence clearly. So I think for teachers who are trying to look at the kind of work they're doing with kids now and get a, it's that sort of reality check. What are we working on, and what do the authors of the Common Core say it looks like? So Appendix C just gives some great information. The speaking and listening standards are very defined, and I would see the speaking and listening, and then the next set, the language standards, as really critical as we look at things for kids with disabilities. We need to understand the progression of oral language as it relates to both reading. Kids don't typically comprehend well when they don't have strong oral language skills. Kids don't typically write well. Writing comes after language. So I think they provide a pretty compelling set of resources for us to sort of think about how we are working with kids as it relates to the development of listening skills, speaking skills, and ultimately language skills. As we know, so many kids with disabilities have language skills, language disorders and language deficits. I think the standards and Appendix A put front and center how critical the development of language skills are. The thing I find most intriguing about the language section is this area on acquiring vocabulary, and this is all in Appendix A. Some really interesting information about just the different sort of tiers of vocabulary. Kids come, everyday speech is Tier 1 vocabulary. It's what we teach kids in the early grades. I'm going to skip down to Tier 3. Tier 3 is what we would call content-specific vocabulary. They're the words we teach within the context of a discipline. What I find really interesting is Tier 2 vocabulary, which is called academic vocabulary, and I think that's misleading in the sense of we tend to think academic is content. But general academic vocabulary really speaks to the kinds of words that we see all the time in written text, oftentimes have meanings across many, many disciplines. But because they're general words, nobody sort of thinks it's their responsibility. You know, clearly a science teacher would notice maybe we're not focusing on things like do we explicitly teach words like determine, explain, examine, those kinds of words which come up in every discipline, and if a student doesn't know those, the text can be quite meaningless to them. This just happens to be an example, Appendix A, and you'll see, can you see in the red, these are what would be called academic vocabulary. The blue are content vocabulary, or Tier 3. And you can see how if you don't understand some of these red words, the rest of the content doesn't make any sense. So I think academic vocabulary as a general rule, is something with kids with disabilities we have to put a heightened focus on. I'm going to quickly just talk about the math standards, and then we'll take some questions. The math standards also have two sections. They're called standards for mathematical practices. These are things that we call sort of habits of mind. They're the kinds of things that sort of the mathematical mind. How do you approach numeracy? How do you approach mathematical problem solving? And they run through all of the standards at all grades, and then the standards for mathematical content are those specific grade level standards. Again, some real changes, shifts in math, and I want to show you a slide. And the two that are most spoken about are focus and coherence. And focus is the idea of let's go narrow and deep instead of a mile wide and an inch deep. I think the authors of the Common Core math standards are trying to get us to have a much more logical way. This slide I'm showing you now, this is a document I came across, the top performing countries in the world on some of the national tests. You can see on the left, these are the skills kids are learning. You'll see the top grade levels. And how focused in the early grades they are on really just a very small number of skills. And those skills then become the stepping stone for the next grade. And there's a real narrow focus on what kids need to know and actually master, and then a logical stepping stone to the next set of skills to increasingly more complex. If you just look at this visual, this is the top performing countries. What I'm going to show you now is this is what the overwhelming majority of U.S. state standards have historically covered. I think you can just look at that visual and see we have gone way broader. We try to cover much more in math each year, and that the authors of the standards are trying to get us to think maybe this is a case where less is more, less meaning we can teach kids things more deeply, get kids to mastery on numeracy skills by mid-elementary school, and then begin to develop higher order skills. They don't have the same appendices in math as they do, but at the end of the math standards, there's a very good glossary, and then they have some very nice tables. Here's just an example of, a table where they talk about common multiplication and division situations. So again, I think there's just a lot of resource material here when we're working with kids who are struggling with math at an early age. So I'm just going to move that on. And I thought I had a slide here. Okay. All right. So I'm moving on now to I added several slides that you don't have. So just to get everybody on the same page, we're on, in your handout, the bottom of page 5. And I'm going to go through a process. Now, this is not going to be the nitty-gritty writing of goals, but this is the basic process of being able to think through how do you write an IEP. And this would be the same process you would use whether we're talking about kids with mild disabilities or kids at the high school with moderate to severe disabilities. This is the metacognition, if you will. This is the thought process. The individual student, the individual setting, the individual grade, all then helps to influence how you go through this process. But the process is the same regardless. And I'll just very quickly go through. I see it as 5 steps you're thinking about. One is you start with what's the long-term outcome for the student? If we make the assumption for most kids it's going to be high school graduation, then pretty much that's the North Star, and we need, that's got to be sort of the gravitational pull, if you will, to saying all the decisions we're making are in service to be moving toward that. Next, we then bring in the individual kid. This is where we look at the student's present level of performance. IEPs that are aligned to standards don't ignore where the student is at, because where the student is performing is so intricately connected to defining what are their disability-related needs. So we may say, I have a student who's, we are looking towards high school graduation. Well, right now, this 4th grader is performing at this level. Here's what they need. They need to improve their decoding skills, or they need to have a better understanding of sequencing, or they need more self-regulation. So we start with their present level, and then once we know what their present levels of performance is, we then look to the standards to say, which standards do we think they're going to have problems with? Not all kids with disabilities are going to struggle to meet standards. Some of them they are going to meet, and some of them we may decide, because IEPs are always about prioritizing, we have to say, given the student's long-term outcome, their present level, which standards are the most significant for them to be working on. IEPs are not the restatement of the Common Core standards. They're saying for this year, what are we on track to do for this student to move them toward the standards as quickly and as meaningfully as we can. So once we know what the student's present level is, and we can begin to prioritize what are the areas, the standards that are most significant for this student to be making progress on, to move towards greater access, we then decide what accommodations will minimize barriers. Again, for some students, we will minimize the barriers through accommodations, and they'll be able to demonstrate what everybody else is able to demonstrate. If a student has strong, auditory comprehension, we're going to know that they can learn the science lesson just like everybody else. They just may need more auditory input than reading. So these are things that have to do with what adults can do to level the playing field. And then when we still say the leveling of the playing field is still not going to address this skill or behavior deficit that's disability related, that's when we say, okay, what is the annual goal? What specially designed instruction will assist this student in developing the skills, the knowledge, and or the behaviors that help them progress towards their vision or their outcome or the standards. So to me, that's the basic metacognitive process, and here's sort of what it looks like. The outcomes, the essential questions. What do we want? What do we expect this student to be doing 5 years from now? And what are the skills, knowledge, and behaviors that are needed to do that? So if we were to say, for students to graduate high school, for students to be able to be career ready, to be college ready, what long-term do we know are necessary skills, knowledge, and behavior? Then we, again, focus in on, now let's get down to the individual student. What skills, knowledge, and behavior does the student demonstrate in a particular area? What we're trying to do is sort of build the idea here of sort of almost a gap analysis. Here's what the kid can do. We know over time we want to get them there. What's the dimension of that gap, and how is the student's disability affecting that? Is it something that we can alter through an accommodation, or do we really have to look at specially designed instruction, at modifications, and what are the disability-related needs to be addressed so that we keep help that student build their capacity to greater access the curriculum. So here's the visual of what that looks like. This is over time. The long-term outcome is the long-term, but now we're beginning to look at, okay, for this year, where is the student at? And we're beginning to look at dimensions of the gap. Then you have to bring in, and it's only after you identify the student's present level and needs that you begin to look at the standards in the sense of what are the standards we think this child is most at risk of not being able to meet. And then what's the purpose of the standard? Can the student demonstrate the standard if we change some of the variables? Those would be accommodations. If the student is not able to demonstrate the standard, is there a disability-related need that we are going to want to address in vis-a-vis a goal? So, and I think this pertains maybe to some of the questions that were asked. How do we decide what are the most important standards? And I think as kids kids who have more significant pervasive disabilities, these are some of the questions that are going to help to say, okay, what is our focus going to be? What's going to be the most enduring thing for this student to learn? And endurance, and this all comes from the work of Doug Reeves, and this is not specific to special ed. He's just a proponent of us asking these questions about all standards, but I think they're very relevant to kids with disabilities. What is it about this lesson that we're teaching the kid now, or the standard that we're teaching the kid in this current instructional setting that has relevance, that we want them to know 10 years up the road? What's the big idea here that we want this child to bring forward? So for some kids, for some math skills, well, they may not learn grade level math, but they're going to learn one-to-one correspondence. They're going to understand cause and effect. These, for some kids with significant disabilities, are the enduring standards. It's the big idea behind the standards we're going to focus on. Leverage speaks to, sort of where will you get the biggest bang for the buck? I mean, something like a critical thinking skill. That you use in multiple disciplines. So where will we devote our instructional time that will have the most, the broadest impact on the student? And then the third one is actually preparation for next year. If this isn't a standard the kid's going to need to build on for next year, well, maybe that's not as important a standard. So I think when we look at kids who might need some significant degree of modification, these are some of the questions we use to make some of those hard decisions. Once we look at a standard, though, we can't just be satisfied by looking at the standard at the most superficial level. We have to drill down and actually figure out what are the skills or the processing, the cognitive processing that any student needs to be able to meet this standard. And here's just an example of things if you looked at it through sort of a language prism, you know, cognition, metacognition, linguistics, metalinguistics. We have kids whose disabilities are in these areas. So we are not going to be able to help a kid meet a standard if we don't drill down to what's the underlying reason for why they're not meeting the standard. So our interventions, our specially designed instruction that then gets captured in a goal is about these processes, not the standard itself. It seems to me IEPs are about what's getting in the way of the kid meeting the standard that's disability related. That's what the goal has to focus on. And we have to align it to a standard because we have to be strategic. And I think that's an idea that people struggle with, that it's not about the standard. All kids need to meet standards. That's what general education classes are for. What is it about this kid's disability that is either preventing it or limiting that? That's what the IEP is about. So you can see the Venn diagram we're moving towards is we're trying to figure out what's the dimension. If you look at the, the two big circles, we may have kids whose present levels are not at the Common Core grade level, and what we're trying to do is over time through the process of the IEP, is each year identify IEP goals and accommodations that will result in the student acquiring more skill, more knowledge, additional behaviors that are necessary to actually move them towards that. So, here's sort of my visual representation, sort of the connective tissue between these two big circles and this, North Star is what are we doing this year, for this 1 year, that's going to change the dimensions of that gap. And then we're going to monitor our progress, and then the next year we're going to come back and write another IEP that hopefully continues to change the dimensions. And then we write another IEP, and eventually, this may not be the case for all kids, but what we're trying, this is alignment. If you look at those dots lining up, what we're trying to do is bring into alignment as best as possible what the student's present level is with the skills, knowledge, and behaviors necessary for them to reach their long-term goals. And there's no absolute, because kids with disabilities are such a diverse group, to what extent these bullets line up will vary considerably. We have some kids where, we expect them to graduate and they're going to demonstrate all the same standards that everybody else is, and they're going to college and they're going to graduate college and so on and so forth. We have other kids where these bullets that are in this perfectly straight line now may be in very, very different configurations. That's the I in IEP. That's the individual part of this. And that's why present levels are so critical, because if we don't start with where the kid is now, we're just wishing for alignment versus strategically moving this child. And again, for some kids, it'll be in a couple of years. For some kids, it'll be many years. For some kids, that alignment will look quite different. But what we need to make sure is that those bullets are moving, each year, as a result of a very strategically developed IEP. So what I want to do is just sort of go through now a couple of different examples, and then sort of summarize this, and then hopefully have lots of time for questions. Here's an example, and these are obviously just made up. They're not based on an actual student. if we were looking at a real IEP, we would have a lot of background information and context. We would have present levels of performance. We would know exactly what the disability is. So we don't have that here. What I'm going to ask you to do is really just looking at the structure. And I have 3 different examples that I can share with you. So here's one of the Common Core standards, right? Informative, explanatory text to examine and convey ideas and information clearly. And these are all, this is the verbiage around from grades 3 through 5. So I'm going to flip to the next slide just so that this metric makes sense to you. And what I did, and this is, it's a very simple process. If I was using this for real, I'd probably break this down into some more finite detail. But each of these boxes here is right from the Common Core writing of informational text. They say kids in these grades write text that include the proper introduction of a topic. Information is grouped logically. They include some kind of formatting, such as when multimedia is useful in aiding comprehension. They develop the topic with facts, definitions, details, etc. They link ideas within and across information. They use precise language, domain-specific vocabulary, and they provide a concluding statement. So this is really merely just I just cut and paste the bullets of those standards, and then said, okay, how would I, set this up so that I could use it as a measurement tool? And basically, I'm just taking the very simple idea of a rubric. 1 would be shows no evidence, 2 some evidence, 3 is adequately demonstrating, or adequately has included this element. Okay, so there are, oh, my math is wrong here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This should be out of 21. Okay, so I've actually messed this up. So, well, but you'll get the gist of what I'm saying here. So going back now to the baseline, assuming there was 27 points there, or 24, I'm saying, okay, now I'm going to write a goal for this particular student who is really struggling with explanatory text. Well, I give this child a sample writing. They produce a sample writing, and then I use the rubric to score. And in this particular case, the student was able to score 10 out of 24 points on that rubric. By the end of the year, I want James to score 20 out of 24 on that rubric. So here's an example of something that's quite specific to the standards, the shift to explanatory text from where most of the time we oftentimes focus on narrative. But what I did was I figured out, where is he at? Now in this particular case, if I looked at this rubric and the student scored 10, well, it's just simple math. There's many of these that the student is scoring no more than a 2, and quite possibly they're only scoring a 1. In my present level of performance, I would be articulating which of the skills the kid is adequately doing and which are the skills he is currently not demonstrating and why. Is this a metalinguistic issue? Is this a cognition issue? And what am I going to be working on so that over time the student is better able to perform some of these indicators? Here's another example. This is around reading fluency. This is, where we would be focusing really on a basic, acquisition of basic reading skills. Kids who might still be learning to read at the word level. They're still learning decoding skills. They're learning, sight words. All of the grade levels have standards that kids will be able to accurately and fluently read. So here's an example of where if I was working with I might actually have a 4th or a 5th grade student here, but they're currently actually able to read fluently at a 2nd grade level, and I may be trying to get them to read at a 3rd grade level. Read accurately and fluently at a 3rd grade level. So again, I have baseline. How is the student currently doing? In this case, the child's reading 10 words in a minute. By the end of the year, I want them to read 98 words in a minute with no more than, a certain number of errors. This is a standard right out of the Common Core, yet allows me to work very clearly on a basic skill that's based on the child's present level of performance, even though the student might actually be a 5th or a 6th grader. This is an example of one that I would see maybe for a student who's more either cognitively involved or maybe what you're referring to as cross-categorical, significant language. Here's the standard. Use information gained from illustration and the words. Actually, this thing is words in a text to demonstrate understanding of a text, where, when, why, and how key events occur. My baseline is currently after listening to an informational text passage. Tracy could not select a picture from a field of 3 options in response to who and what questions. By June, after listening to an informational text passage, Tracy will correctly select a picture from a field of 3 options in response to who and what questions. So I think here's an example of a child who may actually be working on an alternative set, might be taking an alternative assessment, but you can still see that standard is in the Common Core. I'm allowing this child to demonstrate some critical skills about literal comprehension. In this particular case, it's listening comprehension and the use of pictures, which might all be part and parcel to a greater communication system we're building for this child, is to be able to communicate through pictures. So these are just 3 different examples of how I think we can take the Common Core and build very specific, very measurable goals that, depending on what each of those individuals' long-term outcome was, if progress was made on any of those goals, that those students would be on a trajectory, if not closing their gap, but narrowing that gap around those strategic skills. So I'm going to just sort of sum this up, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions or review of any of these ideas. So again, final thoughts. Standards are for everybody. I mean, these are not general ed standards. They're standards for all kids, and they're useful in framing level of attainment. Okay, am I back now? Hello?
You're back. Sorry about that.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I just got a message saying I was muted. So we're looking at framing levels of attainment. Standards are used for framing levels of attainment, but kids are going to reach those standards with different depth and levels of attainment in each competence area. There are a set of common expectations, and students may reach them in different ways and at different times. And we have some students whose needs are more significant and disabilities have a more profound impact. We have to, within limits, be able to say we will actually modify standards for some students at particular points in time. And I think if we don't understand these bullets, we're going to trivialize the standards, and most importantly, we're going to trivialize the IEP document itself. That the IEP document requires us to align to the standards, but not at the expense of ignoring kids' present levels of performance. And that's, I think, the complex dance the educational field has, is how can we start off with the assumption that most kids with disabilities, if we make proper accommodations and we are clear on what the learning looks like, the vast majority of kids with disabilities should be able to meet standards or significantly make progress over time. I'm not saying in 1 year, over time, to narrowing the gap between their present level and their standards, and the standards. And then the last thing that, I can't say this enough, IEP goals are about skills and behaviors. They're not about content. They're about skills, changing behaviors. The content for younger kids, the challenge is sometimes the skills are the content at the early grades. The reading content at the early grades is learning how to read. Once kids go beyond the basic reading skills, IEPs are not about science. They're not about social studies. They're about the skills and the processing and the behavior that kids are struggling with in order to meaningfully interact with the content. And I think that's, if we can approach IEP writing continually through the lens of some of these final thoughts, and to be able to say, well, the student isn't at grade level, but they're not at grade level yet. The purpose of public education is to move kids forward, and we need to use standards to actually raise the bar and raise the quality of instruction for students with disabilities. The standards should not be there to put kids with disabilities at greater risk. And I think it's all in how we understand the standards and what our approach to, good quality education is.